fourth and last topic for this panel is what's so deep about deeply divided societies dealing with Lebanon's sectarian system by Dr. Rima Majed. Dr. Majed is an assistant professor of sociology at the Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies Department at the American University of Beirut, PhD holder in the relationship between structural changes, social mobilization, and sectarianism in Lebanon from the University of Oxford, principal investigator on the critical approaches to development studies project at the American University of Beirut, published researcher in journals, books, and media platforms, co-editor of the upcoming book, The Lebanon Uprising of 2019, Voices from the Revolution. Dr. Majed. Yes. And allow me as well to welcome Mr. Samir Aita. Mr. Aita is the president of the Circle of Arab Economists. He holds a DEA from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and Institut National des Sciences et Techniques Nucléaires, and from HEC Management. He also served as CEO for Framasoft and set up a consulting company in economics and information technology. Mr. Aita will be discussing Dr. Majid's paper titles, Who is Deep About Deeply Divided Society? What's so deep about deeply divided societies dealing with Lebanon's sectarian system? I want to just again remind our author that we have 15 minutes to the presentation, and for the discussant 6 to 7 minutes, and then we'll give the floor to the questions from the public. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Stop me when you need to.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Okay, here? Do I click here? Okay. Well, thank you very much for those who organized, and a special thank you for those who are still here. It's been a long morning, so thank you for staying. My talk today is entitled, What is so deep about deeply divided societies? And it probably is trying to tackle the elephant in the room and all of these different subtopics we're talking about, whether it's the judiciary system, the economic system, etc. Sectarianism seems to be the one on, the topic we cannot escape, but at the same time, it also seems to be it's a mega concept that we use a lot, but that we define very rarely. And so what I'll do today, this does not seem to be working. Okay, great. So as I said, the topic is about sectarianism, and what I'm really trying to think about here is, Lebanon is a deeply divided society, or at least so they say, but really from a sociological perspective, so what? I mean, does anyone know of any shallowly divided society? Do we know of any society where divides do not exist at all? So the question seems to be beyond really the social divides, and here I'm talking from a sociological perspective, trying to understand what do we really mean when we move from the sociological level of understanding social dynamics to thinking about policy prescription and thinking about systems of governance that need to be put in place. And of course, I mean, this is a claim, the claim of deep divides in some societies that we've seen in many other countries, such as, of course, Nepal, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Northern Ireland. More recently, we hear about this in Syria, Libya, Yemen, and of course, I mean, Iraq, where we have seen, I'm happy to talk more about this, but an update or an experiment for an updated theory of the deeply divided societies. So what is really this implication of talking about certain societies, mainly societies in the global south, as societies that are deeply divided? And what does it really mean? So what it means, at least in the case of Lebanon, is that it had two main implications. The first is an institutional implication, or an approach that we call consociational democracy, or a sectarian power sharing. that is based on the assumption that this is a society divided into different groups and that we need to separate these groups and represent them in order to maintain peace. The other approach is a civil society approach that has attracted huge funds from international and local donors. That is an approach based on peace initiatives, inter-religious dialogues, etc. And the idea is that people are divided along identities, and if we bring them closer together, if we put them together in one room, have them do certain activities together, they will realize that they're all the same, and this contact theory that came from social psychology. Okay, but in fact, I mean, while the two implications are quite contradictory, one is about separation and the other is about bringing people closer together. So what I'll do today is I'll try to take this talk a bit further to criticize the premises of this deeply divided society framework. I'll try to trace where it came from and why it does not really tell us what social dynamics are actually about. I will then try to discuss a bit what the conceptualization of sectarianism, what do we really mean when we say sectarianism, and why is it better to think about sectarianization as a process rather than sectarianism as a fixed phenomenon. And finally, I will try to put forth the concept of sectarian neoliberalism, and I'll argue that in order to really think about the crisis of Lebanon today, and to really understand political sectarianism more specifically, it's very difficult to separate it from the economic system. And here I would make a case for linking Lebanon to a global system and moving beyond the exceptionalism. I mean, this conference is mainly about Lebanon, but there's nothing exceptional about this country. It's actually part of a global system. And maybe what is scary about what is happening in Lebanon is that it could be the future's past. Lebanon could be telling us a story of where we're all heading in different places. And at the end, I'll try to argue that moving beyond sectarianism does not require an anti-sectarian agenda. It's a bit of an endogenous approach, but rather moving beyond sectarianism requires trying to address what affects sectarianism that is external to it. And mainly political economy, security, and political ideology. Okay, so where does this paradigm come from? Of course, the Lebanese system of power sharing dates back to the 19th century, but and there's a lot of great historical work that is done. The best research on sectarianism in Lebanon comes from history, so we know very much about the beginnings, about how it developed at the turn of the 20th century. We know about the links between sectarianism and the rise of capitalism, but then we know very little about how it transformed later on and what it meant with the transformations of neoliberalism. But the paradigm as a paradigm came from the post-Second World War, mainly political scientists in the West who were very concerned about the rise in conflict and the need for democracy and stabilization or stability. And back then there was this concept that there are certain societies that are deeply divided and that require special types of arrangements. What is interesting, and this is probably more interesting for academics who like to trace genealogies, is that this discussion started as a discussion of deeply divided systems, not societies, but then it slipped in the literature and became about societies. And most of these discussions did not come from sociologists. They mainly came from political scientists who were assuming what social dynamics are rather than studying them. So this discussion has set the agenda for policy-oriented discussions and and the theorization of power sharing or consociational democracy. If we just pause a minute and think about it, it's an oxymoron, right? Democracy and consociation are the opposite of each other. But it became it's a theory that flourished and that became a prescription for many, many countries around the world. But what I'm saying here is that this theory is deeply flawed for three main reasons. So it is built on three assumptions that do not apply in Lebanon or elsewhere, I think. The first assumption is that it assumes that society is a mosaic of different groups. And this is something we hear a lot about Lebanon today, with the elections. And there's a lot of talk about we are a sectarian society, and there's a lot of conflation between sects and political parties, right? And this is the main problem here. The unit that we use in the analysis of sectarianism is the sect, which does not make sense because we're explaining the phenomena by itself, right? And so what we really should be looking for are the actual actors, and the actors are never the sects. It's not the Sunnis or the Shia or the Christians, right? It's specific political organizations and leaders. And here is a very important conflation that is actually, I think, intentionally used by political leaders themselves. If a leader claims to represent a sect, we should not take it at face value. If I now come here and say, look, I represent all of you, why would you necessarily believe me? Unless I'm organized politically and speak in the name of. But this is different because in this case, when we look at intra-sectarian divides, such as the case of the Christian community or communities in Lebanon today, it becomes more difficult to conflate the sect with the political stance. Right? It's only when there's intra-sectarian homogeneity, when there's a main leader or a main internal agreement, political agreement amongst the sectarian political organizations, that a political divide gets translated into a sectarian divide. And therefore, assuming that society is a mosaic of sects, to understand sectarianism really is not very helpful. What we should be looking at is these political actors and what they're doing, and leaving aside sects as units for other understandings.
2 minutes.
Oh my God. Okay, so I'll really move very quickly. The second is assuming that these vertical divides are enduring. Well, Lebanon's history is very long and tell us that these divides are surely not enduring. I mean, we can, at least in the past 100 years, we can at least talk about 4 main shifts. Druze Maronite and Mount Lebanon, Sunni Maronite, Christian Muslim, Sunni Shia, and who knows if we're moving to Shia Christian again or some sort of change in that discourse. And the third, so of course, I mean, these divides are not enduring. Sectarianism and sectarian divides keep on changing, and they're very related to their politicization. The third assumption is that societies that are not homogeneous are more prone to violence. Again, there's no such thing as a slip into war. Wars are political decisions. Wars are not social explosions. It's not because people are different or because there's heterogeneity that we're going to go to war. War requires armament, it requires financial support, it requires training. So there's no way we are going to slip. ما في انزلاق بحرب. It's a decision. Okay, and in that sense, what makes us think, so if this whole framework started to think about the importance of democracy, the question here becomes, is democracy only about representation? And as Nizar just said, the Lebanon quota system is not a system of quotas that to represent historical minorities that are oppressed. It's actually the exact opposite. It's a quota system that represents those who are strongest, rather than minorities who are oppressed. So it's the opposite of the logic of what a quota system would be. And in this case, then, the question becomes, democracy only about representation, or is it also about redistribution? And what does this tell us about sectarianism? So since I don't have a lot of time, I'll just say here quickly that understanding this mega concept of sectarianism requires that we move from the dichotomy of either negating its presence, that sectarianism is not important. Well, there is sectarianism and we have to deal with it. Or assuming that everything goes back to sectarianism. So we shouldn't be blind to it, but we also should not be blinded by it. And this is where the importance of thinking about the processes of sectarianization and the importance of dissecting the concept into its different facets. So legal sectarianism, in the sense of the civil rights law, is not exactly the same as political sectarianism. They feed into each other, but these are separate phenomena, and we should understand them as such in order to be able to better understand the mechanisms of this structure that we live under. But I'll move to my last bit, where I link this idea of redistribution and identity politics to zoom a bit out and say that the story of Lebanon is probably interesting or important, not just because we are here and we're interested in it, but because it tells us a broader story of the marriage between identity politics and neoliberalism, and what it does in terms of thinking about clientelism, for example, or thinking about what does it mean when, and in the case of Lebanon, it's been a neoliberal economy from the very onset. So we have, while the global history of neoliberalism talks about the 70s as the turn, Lebanon has been neoliberal from the 40s. So probably this is a case that tells us if the world continues this way 3 decades ahead, we might be heading to the catastrophes we're seeing here. What does it mean to deregulate labor and markets? What does it mean to weaken welfare in the state? Because, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the absence of the state. There's no absence of a state. This is the shape of our state. There's an absence of welfare or redistribution. And in that sense, moving beyond all the talks about corruption, for example, I'm not saying there's no corruption, but the problem is really in the structure, because unemployment is not about corruption. The problem of unemployment is the problem of a structure and a shape of an economy. So in that sense, and I'll wrap up here saying that in order to think of sectarianism and ways to dismantle it, we need to think of the two pillars together, sectarianism or sectarian neoliberalism as a phenomena where these two aspects feed into each other to create the realities we live under today, and where clientelism can flourish in its different shapes. I just want to finish by saying clientelism is not just economic. It's more and more taking the shape of security clientelism, especially in this crisis where some parties have lost the spoils of the state. And this is where the judiciary system and security has become an important aspect of clientelism in Lebanon, and one that we should be thinking more about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Majed. Mr. Aita. Mr. Aita, the floor is yours. We'd like to hear your analysis about the paper of Dr. Majed.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come here, but as in my life, late life, I'm a political economist, I would have preferred to make my discussion on the financial crisis. But I think that someone, maybe very smart, knew. So some of my old history as an anthropologist who works specifically on sectarian systems, and by the way, the subject was on the Alawi community, mainly in Syria, who had been preserved for centuries without having a structured religious apparatus. And this is a unique case in the region, comparatively to the Druze or the Maronites. So maybe there's some smart guy who knew about this story. So I have the privilege to discuss Dr. Rima Majed paper. While I don't come from the same background, it means French educated more than the American ones. So, but let me first make a comment that concepts in sociology are like theories in physics. They can only have meanings or sense if they are efficient, and the word efficient is very important, like what Marc Roger used to say. Be efficient to explain reality and maybe to help changing the reality. If not, what is the use? But then what is the reality that we are talking about with the concept of communities, sectarianism, or deeply divided societies? Is it the reality of the society, or precisely of the relation between this society, however divided, whatever is its heritage, and the state it has created or somebody created for it, like in the case of Lebanon, and something I call the power. Please bear me to understand the word power like me, which means not like the general discussions about political power, but some kind of body which is above the state and which has its own mechanisms, and which has to be looked at for its mechanisms. Dr. Majed devotes a large part of its paper to rightfully criticize the concept of deeply divided society as deeply flawed. She precisely explained how it shifted from trying to explain political dynamics toward describing social dynamics as if they were two independent things, with the excuse of the theory builders that it is difficult to institute democracy when the society is deeply divided. But she could have more strongly put the parallel with the colonial period concept of identity minorities, which was used for the colonization specifically on this region, and which has been largely criticized by our friend George Corn, who is from this university. He made specific book on this. Also, the argument on the shift between the two, moving from politics to society to talk about division, came after World War II. I argued that a little bit because it was mainly after World War I, with the end of the multicultural empires like the Austro-Hungarian or the Ottoman empires, or maybe the end of the USSR, which was also a multicultural empire. By the way, the Ottoman Empire, adopting a very conservative Sunni Islam, had no problem to include the Druze and the Alawis, these kuffars, non-believers, and etc., in its state and legal framework. This is a very interesting case. The Ottoman arranged many of them to be muqaddam or beyk, ruling regions by themselves. For example, look what the word khair beyk, which is very famous, Alawi family means. Beyk is an Ottoman title. Dr. Majed has very well put a strong argument that sects are not eternal, but ever-changing, and that violent civil conflicts are not really caused by social or sectarian groups, but by struggle on power. However, our history shows clearly that sectarian conflict appeared precisely when the Ottoman state weakened and foreign colonial power intervened to assumably protect minorities. So we are talking about the state and its influence on the society. Dr. Majed is also right when she explains that long periods of non-violence are not due to coexistence, but to simple existence. But she doesn't explain to us how existence is. She is also right to question if democracy is only about representation, or is it also and mainly about redistribution. But again, without addressing specifically who should operate this redistribution, and without addressing the state as a body in itself. The other major concept introduced, I'm discussing the paper as really a scholar way. The other major concept introduced by Dr. Majed is sectarian neoliberalism, characterizing Lebanon since its creation. This concept is, in my opinion, much more efficient in sociology and in political economy, but it merits to be developed further. However, it needs also a more in-depth, efficient description of whom it serves, this sectarian neoliberalism. From the beginnings, is it the local, is it the regional, or the foreign powers who capture the state? Let me give you one example from Lebanese history. The 1956 Bank Secrecy Law, which came not after troubles in neighboring countries. It came 1 month, less than 1 month after the nationalization of the Suez Canal by Nasser and the nationalization by the democratically elected parliament in Syria at this period, 1956, which seized all the money of the French and the British, including Banque de Syrie de Liban. So the response of Lebanon with the bank secrecy law were for whom? The local elites or the foreign elites? I think it needs some investigation at some point.
Mr. Aita, just to remind you, time 2 more minutes.
Yes. So Syria was then done. Okay, I explained this. So, but let me get to the 4 policy implications that Dr. Majed discussed in her paper, asking a few questions. First, is the power body controlling and weakening the state institutions in Lebanon really sectarian? Or does it use the sectarian clientelism to control state and society? In other words, does the 6 power players in Lebanon work only for themselves or for other hidden players, both internal, such as the big oligopolies? We talk about bankers, but not the guys who control the medicaments, the oil, and everything, the cartels. Or external, not only internal, but also external. And thus, will things really change if one of these 6 players change position, is weakened or is more strong? Second, can the issue of Lebanese sectarianism and of desectarianization of the political system be posed only through sectarian political parties and their analysis, not addressing the sectarian religious organizations and their relations with the power state and society, analyzing how they interfere in politics? Well, this is not allowed in France, for example, how they are exempted from taxes, how they run their wealth and waqf. Why this is still taboo in Lebanon? Has the issue of representation to be posed per se? Dr. Majed, of course, is condemning the blocking of non-sectarian political minorities in political life, meaning the parliament. But the play on representation is a gangrene, and it was explained very well this morning, at all levels of state institutions able to block any best non-sectarian government. How do we go to non-sectarianization? Is it by NGOs, civil society organization, with all what is commonly known about their own capture by power groups, foreign or local, or by a strong political organization? This is a question for the Lebanese. Other question is the existence of non-state military. This is the most sensitive subject, organization, the cause or a result of the weakness of the state? This is a major question. As supposedly the state is supposedly the only to have legitimacy to use coercive power. 2 last questions. What are the conditions that could lead to the Lebanese society to stop being convinced that their government should result from a possible bargain between not local powers, foreign powers? These foreign powers using precisely the sectarian divide to have an influence to bargain about. Last questions. What kind of state ruling transition is necessary for Lebanon to take it out of its ever-continuing today financial, economic, and social collapse? It's a collapse, and it didn't end yet. And are the necessary reforms only financial and economic, or also and mainly political? Could the political system, even with the elections, lead to any solution of the crisis today? Reforming precisely the political system that led to this disaster, the political system lying precisely on the relations between the power body, the state, and the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Aita. your intervention is full of questions, but we'll give the opportunity to Mr. Daher and the public to ask their questions to Dr. Majed. Mr. Daher.
Thank you, Dr. Majed. Thank you, Dr. Aita. You have already several questions, Dr. Majed. I will not add additional burden on you, but I wanted to inquire about something I have noticed from your excellent presentation that I have just discovered, that sectarianism is not a particularity of Lebanon, and that it has existed in several countries and from a long time ago. However, do you consider that sectarianism coupled to oligarchy and kleptocracy, coupled to lack of citizenship, coupled to lack of feeling or spirit of belonging to the country, is a Lebanese particularity? And besides, we have noticed that in the world, countries that have encountered similar situation, like, for example, for instance, only Rwanda, Ivory Coast, South Africa, Liberia, we found that there were, with those countries, a turning point where something have changed. But in Lebanon, from an historic point of view, we encountered similar situation and nothing have changed. To the contrary, we always collapsed and collapsed. This is for the first question. For the second question, you have addressed the idea of sectarian and neoliberalism. And I will break the taboo, Dr. Aita, and say that in Lebanon, as you know, from an historical point of view, neoliberalism or liberalism or wealth has always been identified, has been or assimilated to a religious community. Before the war or during the war, the first years of the war, they have considered that the Christian were the wealthy people and the liberal, and the Muslim were the progressists or the socialists. After the 19th, after Taif, until 2005, it was the Sunni who were liberal and the other communities that were not. And after 2006, and with the wealthy Shia from Africa and from Latin America, we have considered at that moment that the Shia were liberal and the other community were not. And I want your point of view concerning this situation. Thank you.
Okay, any question from the presence before giving Dr. Majed the floor to answer? Yes.
Yes, I just want to congratulate Rima for a brilliant presentation. I think you were perfectly spot on, and it was very timely because we are living in a day and age where all these culturalist, essentialist approaches are coming back in force. It was previously restricted to the lunatic fringes, and now this discourse is becoming mainstream in Lebanon. The idea that every sect supposedly has its own historical narrative, and that the only way out of the Lebanese crisis is for each sect to go it alone. And I would really encourage you to turn this presentation into a book, because it would be a perfect complement to what Usama Makdisi did with the culture of sectarianism. I know that historians have worked on this, political scientists have also touched on this. Samir has mentioned the book by Georges Corom, L'Europe ou le mythe de l'Occident, who also attempted to deconstruct these ideas. But I really think it would be terrific in Lebanon in 2022 to have a work coming from a sociologist debunking all these assumptions, all these foundational myths on which Lebanon was based, and that were one of the reasons that led to the current collapse. So I was really most interested in the presentation. My only question perhaps would be, how would you explain the fact that the Lebanese society was particularly receptive to these discourses? Is it because of the missionaries in the 19th century? Is it because of all those Orientalist writers who came to Lebanon and viewed it as a mosaic, as merely a juxtaposition of sects? There was a famous book by Maurice Barrès, a French ultra-nationalist leader a French ultra-nationalist thinker, and also a leader of the nationalist current in France, who came to Lebanon and wrote Enquête au pays du Levant. And today, and he basically analyzed, spent a few days with the Druze, a few days with the Maronites, etc. And what is remarkable that is much later, after he wrote this book, that he came to be perceived by major historians like Israeli historian Zev Sternel as a precursor of fascism and even Nazism. So according to Sternel, Maurice Barrès was one of the founding fathers of the radical ideologies that led to World War II. And I'm afraid that this state of mind is still quite dominant in Lebanon. This discourse is going mainstream, so we definitely need people like you to keep debunking these arguments. I agree with what Samir has mentioned in his talk. Samir could also have mentioned the sectarian neoliberalism aspect of your talk. But my only and very simple question, would you consider turning this into a book, and don't you think it would be really timely?
Thank you, Dr. Majed. Not to put pressure on you, but already we are running out of time, so we still have 2-3 minutes maximum. Try to answer as much as possible.
Okay, great.
The questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the very generous feedback and comment. Okay, so lots of questions. I'll try. I probably need another hour to answer in detail. But yeah, Samir, thank you for the close reading, and I agree that, of course, I mean the main question is probably the question of how, the link between power and social division, and how do we deal with this? And of course, I could have said more about existence rather than coexistence. I mean, these are all buzzwords that are very used in describing Lebanon. That coexistence, as if we are making an active effort at living together, right? Whereas social reality tells us a different story. Of course, I mean, there are some people that are socially more sectarian than others, but this is not the whole story of society. We find people who, in some societies, are racist, for example, don't like to mix with others, but this does not, we cannot reduce the whole society to these dynamics. So here, this is where I'm trying to think more, about those concepts of coexistence, of living together, as if we're living together despite the fact that we are different, and who, as I started in my presentation, who knows of a shallowly divided society? It does not exist, right? Your framing of the 6 players, and this is a framing that we hear a lot now, and trying to understand the crisis in Lebanon, is one that I agree with, but I would take some distance from, because it takes us back into this, I think, logic that does not help a lot in thinking about the problem as a problem of individuals. Whereas I think the main problem today is a problem of a political structure and of an economic structure. So just removing those 6 men, and it's not a coincidence that they're all men, and putting in other people does not necessarily change, or will not necessarily lead to a major change. It's a system, as we said, it's institutions. Since the end of the Civil War until today, what I describe the current state of a state, we are completely run by a para-state, by parallel institutions for everything, right? The parliament can be closed for a year or 2, and we will create a round table somewhere else for leaders to discuss. So it's everything, all major decisions are being taken in a parallel system. And power is, or state institutions are being devoid of their power. And I think this is the process that has led to where we are today. And of course, not to say that this again reduces everything. Now, where does this sectarian neoliberalism come from? Is it to the benefit of the local, the regional? I think, again, I am not for the understanding of Lebanon as an island that is detached from the world. Lebanon is very much plugged from its very beginning in a global system, in a regional system, in financial capitalism. And so from the very beginning, of course, it was serving a certain class, and I dare say the word class, because I'm a sociologist. So of course, it's a specific class that is benefiting from this. Whether we're talking about the elite cartels, whether we're talking about the banking system or the bankers in this country, and their relationship with the politicians. So we are talking about accumulation, and this is why I say it's a very particular story, but it's not an exceptional one. It's particular, of course, that the convergence of all of these crises and all of these, ills have come together. But I don't think it's exceptional in the sense that we are starting to see more and more of sectarian neoliberalism and sectarian in its larger sense of identity politics and neoliberalism in many places around the world, deconstructing the welfare state or rolling back the welfare state, and what it will do is a global question that I think Lebanon has something interesting to say about, specifically because processes of neoliberalization have started in this country several decades before it started in other places. Now, the question about how do we desectarianize, it's a difficult question, but I will say this, definitely not by putting in place a new power sharing agreement. Today there are talks about moving away from the parity to a system of thirds, Sunni Shia Christian rather than Muslim Christian. And as Ahmed Baidoun says, the real problem in Lebanon is not its sectarian diversity, but it's power sharing, it's peace agreements. Every peace agreement in the history of Lebanon holds the seeds of the next war. Because every time there's a social and structural change in the balance of power, there's tension around the distribution of power amongst sectarian leaders, and therefore this leads to war or more tension. In that sense, and when I said it's not through just anti-sectarian, so it's not enough to just say I'm against sectarianism, it's not going to go away. What actually desectarianizes are important things like, for example, the labor movement. By advancing labor rights, we are indirectly hitting a very soft spot in the structure of the political economy of sectarianism, which is clientelism. And this is why it's not a surprise that the post-war period saw a very systematic attack on the labor movement. It's the same with the women's movement, right? When you talk about religious courts and sectarianism. Yeah, I mean, the struggle of women in religious courts is at its core an anti-sectarian struggle, even if they don't frame it as such. So I think we need to start looking at process, and this is why I said the importance of processes of sectarianism and sectarianization are not necessarily called sectarian. We can be talking about the rights of the disabled, but be targeting the sectarian system in a very important place.
Dr. Majed, we need to close.
Okay.
So,
great. And Karim, I am working on a book, so hopefully it will be out.
Okay. Yes, but we are running out of time, and we have another panel to start immediately in half an hour, so that's it.
Just two words. One, it's not about the evolution of the mentality of communities. Who cares? It's about the communities themselves and how they exist. One of the points I raised, maybe I didn't explain it well, is that the taboo is talking about the religious apparatus. يعني دار الفتوى والكنيسة المارونية وكنيسة الروم. Nobody is discussing the relation between these entities and the sectarian system you are talking about, because there are interactions. Nobody is discussing their role in political economy. This was the point I was raising. I have no problem with the word class. And my critique on the issue of the welfare state is, to have a welfare state, you have to have a state. And in this country, you have basically all what was explained this morning. You have no state, and no state to make what Karim Bitar was talking about this morning, that the state in France, or the society in France, in the end of the 19th century was very divided, and it was by schooling, by the different things that it was unified.
Maybe you can invite us for another conceptual talk about what is the state.
Exactly. Thank you.
I think there is a state.